Welcome to this week's episode of KESCast. In today's episode, I'm going to be speaking about 3 different literary genres or classifications almost, and those are literary realism, naturalism, and modernism. So beginning with literary realism, what is realism by definition? So, provided by the ever-trustworthy Wikipedia, literary realism attempts to represent familiar things as they are. Realist authors choose to depict everyday and banal activities and experiences instead of using a romanticised or similarly stylised presentation. Therefore, what this means is that authors in this genre tend to avoid artistic conventions such as anything that may be considered supernatural, exotic, or implausible. So we can specifically see these elements in things such as Gothic literature, so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula, all supernatural elements that couldn't be associated to real life and daily activity. All of these characteristics were excluded from realist literature. So with literary realism, there is quite a close connection with the aspects of Romanticism. So Romanticism was the literary genre that came before literary realism, and this was headed by the likes of Blake and Keats and Wordsworth and all the Romantic poets. And Romanticism tend to have this intense tenderness and idealism. And this was rejected by realism because they wanted to place this importance on the ordinary person and the ordinary situation. And they wanted to reject the heroic and aristocratic embraces of the Romantic poets and literature. And they wanted to instead focus on the ordinary working class citizen. So some profound examples of realistic novels during this period would be George Eliot's Middlemarch or Adam Bede, for example. And we can see through this piece of literature a clear filter of context, so what was going on in society during this time. So we can see the impact of the Reform Bill of 1832, of the beginning of the construction of railways and the beginnings of contemporary medical science and medicine. And Middlemarch by Eliot also shows a reactionary mindset within the community, so facing the prospect of social, political and technological change during this period, which is the Industrial Revolution. So some profound examples. And we can see Eliot as having a very specific and realist mindset. So she describes in this quotation her perspectives on realism. She says, "The doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature, and not by substituting vague forms, bred by imagination on the mists of feeling, in place of definite, substantial reality." And it's not just Eliot we see during this time producing realist novels. There are significant examples of realism in Dickens' novels. So we see in Great Expectations the development of Pip as an ordinary boy, as an orphan, grow into a character, to come into money, to go through these hardships that an ordinary man would during this time, all in an urban background which represents the Industrial Revolution very, very accurately. But also we see it through Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, which was published 1854. And we can clearly see this through the ways she marks the new world and the real world at that through speech patterns of particular regions. So in novels like North and South, Gaskell uses Lancashire dialect within her characters, and we can see this in all adaptations of North and South. The main characters possess this northern accent. Furthermore, the Victorian realist novel attempted to encompass themes that were originally rejected or considered a taboo. For example, we see the movement of the poor from rural to urban settings and social mobility that was being afforded because of this new middle class from the Industrial Revolution and this rising middle class. And the reason why the realistic novel becomes the forerunner of Victorian literature is because literary rates and being able to read and a wider education was much more available during this time, and this new emergent middle class were eager to consume these novels and to learn about the ordinary man and the conditions of the workers and the lower classes. But perhaps the greatest departure from early Victorian literature came through the exploration of taboo themes such as sexuality and the focus on the way in which science and technology would revolutionise the world in the upcoming century, or in fin de siècle genres. And we can see this specifically in Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles and the exploration of female sexuality and the treatment of women by men and this depiction of women in a sexual way. And it doesn't shy away from the reality of relationships between man and woman. And I think most significantly during this period of literature, although it's argued whether Dickens is a realist author through works such as Christmas Carol displaying supernatural elements, in Bleak House we see this direct quote from Joe the Crossing Sweeper, where he addresses every affluent member of his own society, and he says, "Dead, your majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day." And I think that quotation depicts clearly that this romantic period of literature where everything is romanticised and is made heroic and tender and depicted in such a beautiful and poetic way, it's brought back down to reality and back down to what is actually happening in society at the time. In society at the time, we see this optimism and opportunity, yes, but we also see this mass deprivation. We also see the country's immigrant population and working class growing. We see changes in industry becoming life-altering. We see machines being built, manufacturing becoming easier, urban areas being expanded. Cities became this new centre of action, and this industrialisation and urbanisation led to major economic and social changes as a result. There was a greater divide between rich and poor, and for the first time there was a larger literate working class. And there was a need for literature that reflected their lives, and most importantly, their real lives. So the next genre or classification of literature during the 19th century is this naturalism, and naturalism actually shares some characteristics with realism and is considered a branch of realism. So naturalism was a literary movement from around the 1880s to 1930s that used detailed realism to suggest that social conditions and environment had an inescapable force in shaping human character. And it was mainly an organised literary movement that sought to depict believable everyday reality, and this opposed movements such as Romanticism and the subjects which may receive a symbolic, idealistic, or even supernatural treatment. So that is the shared characteristic with realism here. And naturalism was considered this outgrowth of realism, and it was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution during this time, a key scientific development during this Victorian period. And naturalistic works often included a sordid subject matter. For example, Zola, who is considered the main naturalist author, treatment of sexuality and pessimism and these negative but realistic ideals. So, by definition, then, naturalism was similar to realism in its rejection of romanticism, but it was distinct in its embrace of determinism, detachment, scientific development, and social commentary. And we can really see these works in American literature as well. So, for example, we see in Sister Carrie, Theodore Dreiser, we can see naturalistic elements through that and through the depiction of marriage also. But Zola is normally considered the main founder of this naturalist literature. So finally then we move towards modernism, and literary modernism has its origins in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it was mainly in Europe and North America, and it's characterised by this self-conscious break with traditional ways of writing in both poetry and prose fiction. So these modernist authors experimented with literary form and expression, and the movement was driven by a conscious desire to overturn traditional modes of representation and to express new sensibilities of their time. And contextually, the horrors of the First World War helped to shape this modernist ideal, and we saw these prevailing assumptions about society being reassessed, and modernist writing engages with technological advances and societal changes moving into the 20th century. So, for example, the theories of Sigmund Freud and Ernest Mach influenced modernist literature massively, alongside Henry Bergson, who emphasised the difference between the scientific clock time and the direct, subjective human experience of time. So these key movements in psychology were having a profound effect on literature. And his work on time, this is Bergson, and consciousness had a great influence on 20th century novelists, especially those modernists who used this stream of consciousness technique, so the way that the literature was narrated. And we can see this in, for example, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So within Virginia Woolf's literature piece of work here, we see Mrs. Dalloway as this individual character, and it's depicting a day in her life. It is going through each day-to-day activity, this stream of consciousness, how the world is perceived from this individual character. But let us not forget poetry during these literary genres. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land from 1922 is this introspective, darker aspects of human nature exploration. And early modernist writers, especially those after World War I and the disillusionment that followed, they broke this implicit contract with the general public that artists were the reliable interpreters and representatives of mainstream middle-class culture. And instead, these authors and these poets developed the unreliable narrator. And from my own personal A-level studies, I can see this significantly in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and with Nick Carraway being the narrator. From the commencing chapter, we see him being the victim to not one but a few veteran bores, yet him describing how he's inclined to reserve all judgment. That immediate juxtaposition introduces this unreliable narrator who depicts these middle-class values in a way that we question. And The Wasteland, coming back to this poem by T.S. Eliot, is described as mirroring the futility and anarchy in its own way, with a fragmented structure and the absence of an obvious central unifying narrative. And the way that Eliot described his aim with the poem was to represent the decay and fragmentation of Western culture. So thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you are interested in any of the themes that I have discussed today regarding realism, naturalism or modernism, then I would really recommend a BBC podcast from In Our Time by Melvyn Bragg, and he discusses with 3 professors Victorian realism and also a little bit on Romanticism and Naturalism, and that is where I got the majority of my information for this podcast. I'm also choosing to write my personal statement on the themes and topics discussed today, with the hope of studying English and history at university next year. But I just wanted to end the podcast by expressing my hope that all is okay during this time and that you are all staying healthy and happy and that your families are safe. So thank you so much for listening to KESCast today, and we will see you in the next episode.